Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Est-ce que vous m'entendez
Good evening,
bien?
everyone. Can everyone hear me clearly?
Je crois que c'est bon. Voilà.
I think so.
Bonsoir
Good
et
evening
bienvenue
and
pour
welcome
cette rencontre intitulée
to
Le
this
facteur animal
evening
interterrestriel,
on the animal factor between the
qui a
earth and
lieu
the
dans le cadre du
sky,
programme
which is
d'écriture des
part
lieux
of
ici à la
the
Fondation
nature writing
Michalski. Je
series
m'appelle
here at
Dariouch
the
Ghavami.
Michalski
Je vais
Foundation. My name is
accompagner nos
Dariouch
deux
Ghavami.
invités,
I'm going to be
dans cette soirée. Je rappelle donc
talking
du
to
coup
our two
que
guests
cette
this
soirée
evening. Let
sera
me remind you
faite
that
en anglais et en
this
français. Vous avez mis
is
des boîtiers à
an
l'entrée
English and
pour la
French session,
traduction.
and I hope you
Le
will have
canal
found
1,
the
c'est pour entendre le
headsets.
français. Le canal 2, c'est pour
Channel
entendre
1
l'anglais.
is for French, Channel
Je
2 is for
remercie d'ailleurs
English,
par
and I'd
avance
like
nos
to
interprètes pour
thank our
faciliter
interpreters
ces
for
échanges-là.
facilitating our communication this
Mya-Rose
evening.
Craig, bonsoir.
Mya-Rose Craig, good evening.
Bienvenue.
Welcome.
Violaine Bérot, bonsoir. Je suis très heureux de vous
Violaine
accueillir.
Bérot, very happy to be with
Suite à
you
notre
here this
discussion,
evening.
on aura la possibilité de pouvoir échanger avec vous. Vous pourrez poser,
After the
pour une dizaine de
discussion with
minutes
the two
vos questions, et
authors,
puis ensuite
we'll
je
have time for
répondrai. Et
questions
la
from the audience, and then there'll be some drinks served, and our authors will be signing their books.
Voilà, au cœur du travail de nos deux invités, je crois, réside
I think at the heart of the work of both of these authors is the concept of otherness, whether it's human, animal, or nature-based. So I think this could be a good central point for our discussion this evening. You probably know both of these writers, but let me introduce them all the same. Violaine, let me start with you. You're an author. You've published over 12 books. Du côté des vivants just came out in 2025. Writing has always been a part of your life. Even though you have an atypical background, you studied philosophy and then information science. And you worked in that latter field for several years while continuing to publish books. And then you tossed it all in to do what many of us might dream to do, back to roots, raising goats in the mountains. You went back to your birthplace, the Pyrenees, and bought a herd of goats. And then you found that it was too difficult to write because you were spending all your time taking care of the goats. So for 12 years, you barely wrote. You only wrote one text. I won't tell you which one that was. Among the themes that emerge in your writing, there's motherhood, children, interactions between humans, death. You mainly write works of fiction, novels. Your writing is very sharp. The words are carefully chosen. The sentences are worked as if they'd been plowed. They are watered, pruned, fed. And they root themselves deeply and transparently in the density of the gestures, the gazes, and of your characters. So let me ask you, first of all, how you would define your work, what makes you tick. I know that there's joy in your writing. You say at one time in Pastoral that you write the way you raise animals. What does that mean? Well, it's work. It's laborious. Writing is laborious, as was raising and herding goats. It's a life choice. It's the only thing I can do. So it was with great surprise that when I left my job as a computer scientist, which I did not love, and went to live with my goats in the mountains, I was surprised to see that I had no room for writing. There was no room for writing in my life. So that was one of the things that was incompatible with writing. Mya-Rose, good evening. I don't want to speak too quickly so that the interpreters can keep up.
Vous êtes une autrice
britanno-bangladesh. British and
vous êtes un peu, je crois, la Greta Thunberg de l'Angleterre.
Writer. You have a lot of hats. You could be called the British Greta Thunberg. But first and foremost, you're one of the most passionate bird watchers, and you've been bird watching since your very young days with your parents. Your father and your mother, for whom the birdwatching excursions were a way of alleviating the pressure of life, especially the bipolar, due to the bipolar disorder that your mother has. And at a very young age, you started a blog, Birdgirl, in which you recounted your field adventures.
En 2021 puis en 2024 traduit chez Actes Sud.
2021 you published your book Birdgirl. It was published by Actes Sud in 2024. It's a sort of activist notebook.
Pour la question de la justice sociale et environnementale, vous faites croiser
an activist for social justice and nature conservation. At the age of 14, you started your association Black to Nature, which aims to facilitate access to nature for people from minority groups, minority ethnic groups.
Et puis vous recevez en 2020 un doctorat honoraire à l'Université de Bristol.
An honorary doctorate from the University of Bristol. And I think it's just this past May, you
et pour moi, votre écriture elle
completed your
très générationnelle
studies at the University of Cambridge in human sciences, social sciences, etc. Your writing has several facets. It describes, it tells a story. It's also blog style. There's really no filter, no separation between you and your audience. You share everything. You're very generous in your writing. Your work is a mixture of a diary, a field notebook, and a work of popular science. We learn a lot reading Birdgirl about the state of the world, about birds, about mental health issues, and as I said, you're very generous in your writing. So let me ask you the same question as I asked Violaine. How would you describe your writing process? What makes you write, and do you write in the same way that you would observe birds?
Yeah, bonjour everyone. I'm sorry I don't speak any French. It was very interesting writing an autobiographical book because I was very young. I was 17 when I started writing it, so it's kind of like, what life is there to write about yet? But I wrote it because I had this very deep love of birds and I wanted to share that with people. And my favorite review of the book is when people say I started bird watching because I read this, because I understood your love. And it was kind of very difficult to remember everything that happened in my life, and I realized that I remember everything through birds. That's how I've constructed my life. And so kind of remembering what happened, say at this age, I'll be like, oh, I saw this bird and then that happened and that happened. And so I realized kind of this thread going through my whole life. And so it's been amazing to share that with people. And I think it was very scary at first writing this book because it was just supposed to be about birds. And I wasn't expecting it to become so personal, really. There was a lot of things in there that I'd never really talked about with my friends, let alone the rest of the world. But I kind of realized that my life is so intertwined with birds and my love of birds that I can't really explain that love of birds without talking about my life. And I think that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, but how nature and humans are kind of one and the same. But yeah.
Je vais poursuivre avec une question un peu aussi plus personnelle.
Let me ask you a slightly more personal question.
Very
at a very young age, you were involved in adult matters, and I wondered what that experience was like for you as a young girl, adolescent.
I think it was very strange in a lot of ways, but also very important. I was 12 years old when I started environmental campaigning, and I think it's because similar to a lot of other children, I think young people have a sense of kind of moral righteousness in a way that we as adults don't, maybe because there's a better understanding of how everything's very complicated. But as a child, you're just very angry and very worried. And so it felt very obvious to me that I would get involved in these kind of adult matters. And it was kind of incredibly liberating because I had somewhere to put all of these emotions. I wasn't just sat there worried about the world ending. And so it felt very important. And there was definitely a lot of backlash. There were a lot of people who were very rude to me. But I think I became much stronger because of that. And the two traits that I gained that have been very important as an activist and a campaigner is, one, to kind of be very loud and very annoying, and also to be very tenacious, to not give up. And I've kind of come to realize that when people really want you to stop, that's maybe when you're going in the right direction.
So, follow-up question to that. The idea of time, environmental and climate issues, biodiversity loss are emergencies. They're urgent matters. And yet you go out and spend time watching birds, which requires a lot of patience, a lot of time. And writing a book is also something which requires a longer time frame. And I would like to ask you whether these different time frames are complementary or not.
I think that maintaining hope and joy and energy are very important when you're trying to do kind of very big things, if that makes sense. I think that in particular, taking time and resting is very important. I know lots of other youth activists, especially, who kind of really have felt like they have to save the world right now, and by themselves as well. You know, without community, it's just their responsibility. And they're all gone now because they've used up all of their energy and they have nothing left to give. And so I think for me, looking after myself is very important. And for me, that is bird watching. And I think also on top of that, in terms of the environmental crisis, I feel like we have a lot of science and knowledge and information. And so the really important thing is engaging with people and communicating that knowledge and bringing them into the movement, making them care. And I think you do that, you know, through protesting and activism, but also through, you know, conversations and film and media and writing. And so even though my book is mainly about birds, I feel like kind of inspiring a love of nature is how you get people to care about the fact that it's disappearing. And so I feel like kind of both bird watching and writing are very important in terms of my role in the movement.
Violaine, donc notre discussion de ce
Violaine,
soir sur la question de l'altérité.
As I said, the central pillar of our discussion this evening is otherness. Otherness means others. You use multiple narrators. Your stories are told by a variety of voices that lead us through the account of the facts. Why do we have such a plurality of points of view and types of life? Because we're all different. And if we want to tell a story, if I want to tell a story, of course I could use one single voice, an omniscient narrator who describes what he or she sees as the sole truth. I think it's interesting to give a voice to different individuals who are telling more or less the same story, but we realize that it's not the same story. We all see a newspaper article and we remember different things, and we read it in a different way. We're all entitled to our individuality, and no one person has a monopoly on the truth. Our way of seeing people and the world is very subjective. So I like this effect of multiple narrators. I think that the reader can choose the voice that he or she feels closest to and perhaps be shaken in their own convictions. A more conventional author will follow one narrative line, or a reader will be maybe follow one narrator, and then when there's a second narrator, they think, well, what's this? I like to destabilize the reader. I think it's a good way of making people think. In your use of multiple narrators, I thought it was interesting that diversity was a big theme in your work as well, Maya. You meet all these different birds in different parts of the world. I think that the diversity of birds holds no secret for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of the most beautiful things about nature is just how rich it is. And I think it's the same with birds. It's, my favorite thing about writing the book was revisiting these thousands of incredible birds I've been lucky enough to see. And again, I think people who maybe don't have a close relationship with nature don't realize how much biodiversity we really have. In England, for example, people think that there's lots of nature and it's very green, but one of the worst countries in the world when it comes to natural abundance. And so I think it's very important to remind people what we have lost and what we still have to lose. But I also think there's such a diversity of approaches in terms of engaging with nature. And I think that comes from the fact that having a relationship with nature is very human. Historically, every single person had their own unique relationship with nature. And I think I think we need to return to that in order to preserve what we still have. But I think also it's very important for us as individuals to be able to explore that in terms of our mental and physical health and, all of these very practical scientific things, but also because I think nature's just very magical and there's so much kind of beauty within it, and I think it's a shame that not everyone is able to appreciate that.
La question de l'altérité m'évoque aussi
the question of otherness reminds me of the otherness inside each one of us as well. Violaine, your text is very powerful in its oral expression. I couldn't stop myself from reading it out loud. I wanted to know whether this was deliberate. Are you trying to get the reader to read out loud? Do you read your own texts out loud? Yes. I use my ear when I write. I read the text out loud. It has to be like a musical score. It has to sound right. And when I have a text with several voices, several narrators, the reader should be able to perceive the character of the person. As you will have noticed, I never describe the characters or the landscapes, but the only clue you have is the way they speak. We all have a different way of speaking. We all have a different rhythm when we speak. We make the same mistakes over and over. We have little tics in our language. And if I wanted to make a parallel with animals, it's the same. We often say that what differentiates men from animals is language. That's ridiculous. Of course animals have language. I don't even have to mention birds. Even my goats, I could tell by the sound of the voice which one was having her kid, which one was ill. I could have almost written dialogues between them. Vocal communication is very important. I'm more familiar with domestic animals than wild animals, but if you have a herd of sheep with little lambs and you separate the lambs from the mothers during the day so that the mothers can go graze and the lambs stay in the barn where they can sleep, and when you bring the mothers back at the end of the day, if you have 200 ewes and 200 or 300 lambs, all of the ewes are going to call. All of them will call as they get near the barn, and each lamb will recognize his mother's voice. It's a bit deafening for humans, but every lamb can recognize his or her mother. And then I think it's incredible when people say that animals don't have language.
I also just wanted to say it wasn't until the 1960s that scientists decided that animals had emotions, which I think is crazy now, because anyone who has even a cat or a dog knows that they feel love and fear and sadness. And I think that that's so recent that we realize that, at least, you know, officially, that it makes me wonder about the richness of life that animals have that we still don't understand, or maybe don't recognize, underestimate. And I think that there are so many things that we think that separate us from the animal world, such as language, but also I don't know, loving music or singing or dancing or having friends, having family, that I think nature is much less other than we think of it as being, and I think it's more that we don't fully understand it.
Oui, je suis absolument d'accord avec ça.
I completely agree with that. And we hear the craziest things. For example, we hear what the difference between men and animals is our relationship with death, because we're conscious of death and animals are not. But that's totally wrong. If you have a dog who's elderly, on the day that the dog feels that he's about to die, he will go and hide in a place that where he's never been. He knows he's going to die. I've seen animals who are completely aware that they're about to die, even before I noticed it. Let's continue on the topic of death. In Du Côté des Vivants, your latest book, you cover the idea of the end of life. To tie this in with the animal theme, I'd like to ask you whether you accompany a dying animal in the same way you would sit by a human's bedside. Did you do this with your goats, for example? Yes. When you're a herder, you think about death a lot, because when you have a herd, you have to kill some animals sometimes. There are two situations where you have to do so, because you're producing milk or meat or whatever. And it happened to me, not very often, but it did happen to me that there was an accident, and in order to put the animal out of its misery, I had to kill it. So we think about death quite a lot. And when I had to kill lambs for meat, very quickly I refused to work with the slaughterhouses, because the owner is not allowed to go into the slaughterhouse with the animal. You have to leave it at the door, and what happens after that is none of your business. I thought that was very wrong. I preside over their birth. I take care of them all their lives. It's only natural for me to go with them until their death. And the stress level is incredible. They're not in their usual surroundings. There are smells that they perceive in the slaughterhouse. So very quickly, it was illegal, but I've often been on the margins of the law. I decided that I would kill the animals myself, and I had to think about my relationship with death very intensely after that. And after a few years, I realized that my relationship with death that I had with my animals had changed my way of seeing human death, and that my relationship with death was perhaps more at peace than that of other people. For example, when my father passed away, my father was an elderly man. He'd had a very good life, and he was declining physically and mentally. And I think he died at the right time, before he declined further. But when I said that to members of my family, I saw that this upset them, and that they would rather have had him around for another year. But in nature, everything dies. It's the cycle of life. What's not natural, of course, is to die young. But dying at the end of a long life is totally natural.
Maya, ce rapport à la mort,
Maya, Did you also have an experience with the death of birds, for example? What did the death of birds teach you or bring to you?
Birds are very short-lived creatures compared to mammals, so there's always a lot of death, especially when a lot of birds eat a lot of other birds. But I think I completely agree, and I think there can be a lot of beauty in death if you look at it the right way, because it just is incredibly natural. And I think if you think of it in terms of I guess the circle of life, the kind of the nutrients, the success of a predator over prey, I think that there is something very beautiful about that. Or the other way around, if prey manages to escape and outsmart the predator, that's also very fun. But I don't think you can have kind of a love or appreciation of the natural world, or just animals in general, without having a kind of appreciation and understanding of death. Necessary death, not kind of the destruction that we're unleashing on the planet, unfortunately.
So, Mya-Rose, you were the youngest person to see the largest number of birds in the world, over 5,000, half of the species that we know currently. And that was, you started when you were 6 or 7. You say that your endless journey on the Trail of Birds began when you encountered your first hummingbird. Could you tell us a little bit about that encounter, which made you very happy? What was it that you found fascinating about that hummingbird and about birds in general?
Yeah, see, you mentioning that hummingbird immediately made me smile. I saw that bird when I was 8 years old, and I thought it was magical. And anyone who's never seen a hummingbird or a picture of a hummingbird, they're just these beautiful, iridescent, tiny birds that are constantly moving, and they look like jewels. They're incredibly, I think more than any other bird, they truly are magical. And as a child, I'd never really left the UK bird watching, and I love the birds in the UK, but a lot of them are very brown. And so to go from that to the jungles in South America was incredible. But it was also a very special moment because I saw it at the same time as my mum, who at the time was going through a very severe depressive episode. She'd kind of become lost inside herself. I couldn't really see my mum anymore. And it was kind of this first spark of hope, because I saw her come out for a second where she also fell in love with this bird. And I think it kind of taught me for the first time just the transformative power of nature, how important it is for us as humans. And it made me realize it's more than just kind of the joy of looking at birds. It's something that's very fundamentally important for us.
Donc, comme je l'ai dit, et vous venez de le rappeler,
well, as I said, you've just reminded us, Maya, you say in your book that birding is a lovely term. It's not as lovely in French. And it was give you relief from your mother's mental suffering. This makes me think of your book, Comme des bêtes violaines. A little summary. It takes place in an isolated village in the mountains, which is turned upside down by the discovery of an unknown little girl in a cave. And she's accompanied by a boy who's now an adult called the Bear, who has never been able to speak, who's always been different. He was always seen as the simpleton, and who lives in isolation with his mother in the mountains. 14 chapters and 14 voices that tell the investigators what they know about the suspect. Your work is a fable which tells us about the relationship between the domestic and the wild. Could you tell us a bit more about the character, the bear? Well, the bear is the result of an experience I had when I had my goats. During the first years, I was in a farm which was still accessible by car. I wasn't yet up in higher altitudes. And some days I would take in children between 6 and 12 years who primary school-age children who had psychiatric issues and who could not go to school. They were in a psychiatric hospital, and some times they would come out, and I would put them in the middle of my goat herd. My goats were never tied up, never fenced in. And these 5 or 6 children and a few people from the hospital would go out into the field and go into the herd, whether it was the goats or ponies and horses. Society had decided that these children were invisible or should be invisible, that they couldn't learn and they certainly couldn't mix with other children. Between these children and my animals, not always, but nearly every time there was at least one child and one animal who had a most incredible relationship, which was beyond my understanding. I didn't know these children. I didn't know what sort of psychiatric issues they had. I'm not a therapist. I couldn't tell in what way their behavior had changed. I could only tell by what their accompanying staff would say. But some of their reactions were incredible. Let me give you an example. I had some Shetland ponies, very small ones. They were old ponies that had been given to me, who'd had hard lives of work. There were 5 of them, and in the middle there was one who I had never been able to touch. I don't know what he'd been through in his life, but no one had ever been able to touch him. And one day, in the group of children, there was a little boy who was 6 or 7 at the time. He was very agitated. He went out with the other children into the field and immediately went up to this pony. And the pony usually ran off when the children approached. And that day, the pony didn't move. In fact, he came toward the little boy, who opened his arms. They were about the same height, the pony and the little boy. And the pony put his head on the little boy's shoulder. And the little boy put his arms around the pony's neck, and they stayed that way for some time. This pony that nobody had ever been able to get close to, and it didn't change after that. None of us were ever able to touch this pony. What happened between them? I don't know. How did they realize that they were made for each other? I can't explain it. But the little boy came back some months later, and the same thing happened with the same pony. And it never happened with any other child or any other person. So I can't explain that. All I can say is that this little boy was locked up in a hospital all day long. Maybe he would have been happier staying in the field all day with his pony. The bear in your novel has a specific gift. He can heal animals. He understands animals better than the other humans. Yes, well, I've seen this happen. I had a young mare, a draft horse. A 10-year-old boy came to me. I'd been told he was very violent. I'd been told, oh, he's going to cut down branches and he's going to hit the horses with them. He always had a stick in his hand. When he saw this tall mare in the middle of the herd, he dropped his stick, and she was also usually very agitated. I was always a bit wary of her. I kept children away from her. She was very highly strung. And he went straight up to her. So he was quite small. And he put his hands on her udders. She'd never had any foals, so I hadn't ever really touched her there. She'd never had any milk. He put his hand there. He closed his eyes. And I got the impression that she was closing her eyes as well. It was as if they had both found the gesture that would calm them both down. In your book, the little girl is accompanied by a donkey. Their relationship was surprising. This was a young child, 6 or 7. The donkey and she played as if they were old friends. She would stand up, open her arms, and the donkey would come to her. He would push her with his nose, his neck, his chest, until she would fall down. And as soon as she fell, she would start laughing. The donkey seemed to be laughing as well. Of course, animals can't laugh, but the impression it gave was that they were both having a fit of uncontrollable laughter. This is an unofficial translation. Can you be friends with a donkey, Violaine? Of course you can. In my relationships with my animals, these were working animals. They weren't pets. I had horses as well. I used them for pulling wood. I had a horse who was my friend. He was my companion. He was extremely reliable. I had total confidence in him. Yes, you can be friends with them, and you can laugh, you can complain, you can yell with them. Goats can be extremely annoying. They have very strong temperaments, but I have also had lots of times when I would laugh with them, and sometimes they were laughing with me or they were laughing at me, but sometimes we were laughing together. Some lovely moments like that. You mentioned earlier, you were talking about how sensitive animals are. I think that there were times when my herd and I were very sensitive together about the beauty of a landscape. When we walked into a field, for example, it was as if we were all thinking, oh, the light is beautiful today. I've always felt that my goats were very sensitive to the landscape. They would always lie where the view was the best. Maya, have you ever been friends with a bird?
I've definitely had birds that have been my friends. I don't know if I've been their friend. I think especially during COVID, actually. I don't know about here, but in the UK, we were in our houses for maybe 6 months. And so I became very familiar with my garden birds, and I knew the different characters. And, you know, there was the stupid blackbird chick we thought would get eaten by a cat, but it never quite did. Or there was the robin that would always come and say hello in the morning. And I think there was just something very intimate about seeing not just the same species, but the same individual birds over and over again. My favourites were the ravens, which are very rare in the UK now, that were breeding in the woodland near my house, and they'd fly over the village and make these strange kind of raindrop sounds. And I've looked online and I can't find a recording anywhere. And I used to go every few days and from a distance go and look at the nest and watch the chicks develop. And again, I think there was something really special and really intimate in that. And they've never come back. It was just that one summer. But yeah, I think there are lots of birds that I've thought of as my friend, at least.
What I find interesting and exciting in our relationship with wild animals is that there's always a distance compared to domestic animals. With birds, because you're observing them, how do you deal with that relationship? Is it? Do you sometimes feel that you're being observed as well?
I think for me, part of the appeal of birds is just how free they are. It's one of the reasons, you know, it's the fact that they can fly and they can go wherever they want. And some of them are, you know, flying around the whole world and back every year. One of my favorite birds migrates from the Arctic to Antarctica and back again every single year. And I think that there's something very special in that. And it's one of the reasons it's never appealed to have a pet bird, because I feel like that kind of takes away their magic. And birds are definitely watching you much more than we think. I think one of my favorite birds I've ever seen is something called a harpy eagle. which is the biggest eagle in the world. It's about this big, and it lives in the Amazon rainforest, and it hunts by grabbing monkeys and sloths off the top of trees. And I was so excited when I saw one for the first time. I'd been trying for years and years, but they are quite scary birds, and there was a moment where it was looking down at us from the top of this maybe 60-foot tree, and I suddenly had the realization that from that perspective we probably looked like monkeys, and it had a moment where I was like, is this bird going to try and come down and grab us? And it has very big talons, and we left quite quickly after that. But I think birds are always watching, even when you think they aren't.
Lorsque la mère de l'ours,
when the mother of the bear is talking to the policeman, she says, well, this is why we left, because I understood that locking him up in a hospital, no matter what the specialist said, was not the solution, because I knew that it was fresh air that he needed. He needed nature, calmness, and space. So I took him out of the system deliberately, because the life that I had imagined for us was the only one that suited him. This excerpt obviously makes me think about your experience observing birds and your expeditions with your mother with her bipolar disorder. And it makes me think of something your father said just before you left for Ecuador. You were very young then. There had been many difficulties at home, and he says to your mother, the minute we start seeing the birds, all of this will feel very far away. As if all these travels were, as you say, a way of surviving, and birding could help you deal with all your personal problems. Is nature a refuge for people who need it the most? Is it a refuge of people who are in the margins? Or is nature a place for recreation, and is it a privilege, or is it a place where people can be healed?
I think both. I think on a surface level, there's something really fun about spending time in nature. It's why we have so many hobbies. Even as simple as it's why hiking is a hobby. It's going outside. And I think, I do, however, think that a lot of people, at least on kind of a deeper, maybe animalistic level, understand how important going outside is, even if maybe they wouldn't say so. And there are lots of people I know who maybe think of nature as being quite boring, or there's not really anything to do, but it's still very rejuvenating to spend that time outside. And it's one of the reasons that I started my charity, and because kind of very similar to you, I've spent a lot of time taking children and teenagers outside, and there is something so special about watching people fall in love with nature, especially maybe teenagers who, before they come, they're like, oh, it's going to be boring, and then they come and they go, wow, actually there's something really special about this. And for every child it's different, but I do think that overall birds are very popular, and I think they're such a good connection point to nature, because they're so prevalent in our lives. Whether you're in the middle of the city or the middle of the countryside, they are a thread that connects us to nature. And it's why when talking about kind of mental health and wellness with these children, I specifically talk about bird watching, because I feel like it can be kind of a lifeline, really.
Aujourd'hui, on parle beaucoup d'éco-anxiété.
We talk a lot about people being anxious about the climate crisis, the idea of losing the environment, eco-anxiety, and anxiety about future crises. So it seems that nature might also be a place that accentuates this anxiety.
I think maybe. I think most people who really love nature are very concerned about nature. Whether that's, as I discussed before, if you care about something, you want it to be okay. But I think also anyone who spends a lot of time in nature has noticed in their own lives how it's struggling and declining. Even in I'm only 23, and even in my lifetime, there are lots of species or habitats where I've seen it struggle. But I think it's still very important to spend time outside, and I think that the value of that massively outweighs any worries it might create. I think the most anxiety-inducing thing is sitting in your room and feeling very miserable about the state of the world. I think that's the worst thing, and it's the other reason that when I talk a lot with these children, these teenagers, the two things I tell them are like, one, go outside more, even if it's sitting under a tree, because science has shown that spending 20 minutes outside every day decreases the chance of depression by 20%, which is massive. But also I encourage them to go out and to form community, to meet other young people who really care about the environment, because I think that's actually very energizing and very hopeful to remember that there are other people out there who care and are working very hard to do something rather than just kind of sitting without that anxiety. And I think that's how you stay hopeful and how you actually fight for the future.
J'aimerais qu'on revienne sur le personnage de l'ours.
I'd like us to come back to the character of the bear now, named after the wild animal, obviously.
L'ours, comme le loup, c'est le sans voix.
The bear, like the wolf, has no voice. He's alone. He's misunderstood. He's feared. He's also fearful. Frightens people who don't know him. Everyone talks about him and for him. Maya, if you had to give a bird that would symbolize your mother and her illness, which bird would it be?
I think maybe a migratory bird, because I think they're very interesting. As humans, we kind of think that we've unlocked the secrets of the natural world through science, when actually it still holds a lot of mysteries. And one of the biggest mysteries in terms of birds is migration, both in terms of how they know how to do it. We think it's through kind of magnetic forces, but also some of them where they go. We literally don't know where they go during the winter, and an example of that is the cuckoo. We know it goes down into the Congo basin somewhere. We don't know where. But also house martins, which I've been working with someone who is obsessed with house martins recently, and it was only last year that he went to Kenya and discovered where they winter, and it was somewhere that scientists had gone, no, not there, we know they're not there, and they were. And so I kind of think in terms of my mum, it's been a very long journey to try to figure out and understand her. One of the biggest things in terms of a mental illness like bipolar is it's forever. There's no solution. All you'll do is kind of going with the flow and going with kind of the journey of it. And I think also it's been a kind of puzzle to figure it out and to understand her and to get to know it on her terms. And so I think it's a similar thing where we'll probably never completely understand, and that's okay, but we're working with it.
Violaine, lorsque vous élevez des chèvres,
when you were with your goats, you only published one text entitled L'ours, les raisons de la colère, which was an attempt to explain the problems connected to the reintroduction of the bear in the Pyrenees. And you posed the following question. Is modern man getting further away from nature? Is it because he's getting further away that he's attracted by it? Why is it that the Greens are getting the biggest number of votes in cities? And why are the biggest advocates of the wolf and the bear those that don't live anywhere near nature? But here with the bear, in your book, Comme des bêtes, it's the policemen who represent the city that are after him and don't understand him. And it's the villagers who know him, who live near him, that are sure he's innocent. I'd like to know what you have to say about this paradox. I hesitated for some time before I decided to call my main character the bear, because when you live in the Pyrenees, when you're from the Pyrenees like me, the bear is culturally ingrained. And as I've been hearing about bears since I was a child, we learn how to be polite. We learn our manners by talking about the bear. When you meet a bear on the path, you have to say, would you like to go first or shall I? We were told not to mock pregnant women unless you knew who the father of the child was, because the father might be a bear. So there's a lot of popular tradition and education involving the bear in the Pyrenees. This is why its reintroduction in the Pyrenees was so complicated. People always ask me, are you for or against reintroduction? I'm neither. When I had my goats, if a bear had come anywhere near or gone past my herd, that would have been fine. I would have been delighted to see a bear. But if a bear had attacked my herd, I would have had to fight the bear. That's when you have animals, you have to defend them. Now, it's worth asking ourselves whether we should continue to have domestic animals. But the bear and the wolf are very complex issues. There is a paradox there. And I called my character the bear. He's a character who the villagers support, those who live far from the cities. Because I think it's fair to say that in the mountains, in the Pyrenees, we are happy that the bear is there. I don't know if we can really call these wild bears because they were raised in Slovenia and then released. They're semi-wild, but we're very happy that the bears are there. But we also want to be allowed to protect our herds. This is nature. There are predators and prey, and we have to be able to defend ourselves against predators. But we are a predator for the bear. What I see in your work between domestic and wild or semi-wild animals is all about understanding. Those who understand the character, the bear, don't really have a problem with him. Or at least they can put themselves in his shoes. Yes, because we live in the wilderness. I still live in a very isolated place in the mountains, in the middle of the forest. There are no other houses anywhere near me. You can't get to my house by car. I don't have running water or electricity. And the first question people always ask me is, aren't you afraid? No, I'm not afraid. I'm much more afraid in a city. Why would I be afraid where I live? I'm careful when I walk home in the evening or at night because I might meet a wild boar. I don't want to get between a wild boar and her young, but I'm not afraid. So when there's enough space, we're not afraid of each other. So the notion of everybody having their own living space is important. I think this aggressivity is connected to the lack of space. It's the same thing with a herd. When there's not enough space, there are conflicts. And it's the same for humans. So we are animals, after all. Let's not forget that. And we react the same way animals do. The bear is a character who doesn't speak, but everyone talks about him. You use your many narrators to describe him. But I did feel that it was very unfair that he was absent. He wasn't questioned. Everyone is questioned by the police, but the bear. It was as if he had been made invisible a second time. And I wanted to ask whether your intention was to avoid anthropomorphism, because he doesn't speak, so you don't want to describe his interrogation. Well, I tried to get him to speak, but it just didn't work. So that text was thrown in the bin. I like the idea of a character who's a blank slate. You can do what you want with him. There are people who are invisible in our society, in psychiatric hospitals. There are entire categories of people that we don't want to see. We don't want anyone to see. People in prisons, people in retirement homes. These are people who we say we can't find a place for in society, but I'm sure we could if we tried. And so we make them invisible. And part of making them invisible is to shut them up. So, of course, the police are not going to let him talk. But the mother says, bring him to me. He can't speak, but I can understand him, and I can tell you. I can answer your questions. But the institution doesn't want that. It wants a direct witness statement from the witness that they can write down. Just a couple of final questions before we open up to the public. We've talked a bit about activism with you, Mya-Rose. Could you tell us a bit about your foundation, Black to Nature? An article was published in The Guardian in 2019, written by Stephen Moss, who talked about the emergence and the evolution of nature writing, current in literature, which has a typical profile. The authors are often middle-aged white men over 40, telling us about their experiences, very aesthetic experience of nature, quite passive experiences. And your book is aesthetically pleasing, but it's also very political. So I wanted to ask you two things. Could you tell us a bit about how you started your foundation? And secondly, is nature writing today possible without a political dimension?
What was your first question? Sorry, I got distracted.
Could you describe your foundation, Black to Nature, how it was born, and tell us whether nature writing today has to have a political dimension to it?
Yeah, sorry, it's strange with the French, English in my ears. I was very young when I set up my charity, and so I think I kind of fell into it. I followed a series of steps where I didn't realize where it was going, but each one felt obvious. It started off with a single event where I wanted to share nature with other kids my age who looked like me, which ended up as a 13-year-old having all these organizations writing to me and going like, oh, you know, can you come and advise us? And I went, no, I'm 13. And so I ended up organizing a conference with actual experts. And then from there, I realized that this was, you know, diversity and accessibility were much bigger issues than I'd realized. And it ended up with me setting up this charity because it felt like a logical step. It is kind of a bit crazy looking back because I was kind of maybe 13, 14, but it felt very obvious at the time, and it was something that was very important to me. I think, I wasn't doing deep dives of my psyche at the time, but I think in retrospect, it was very important because of my mother's mental illness and the way that birds had been so important in my life. And then so I had this very deep desire to share that with other people. It felt very important to me. And so all of that, you know, it's been over 10 years now since we set up. We've worked with hundreds of children, and every person that's fallen in love with nature because of this organization has just been very special, and it feels like another step towards a greener future. Because I don't think that nature writing can be apolitical now, or maybe it can, but I think that's maybe very boring, which I'll be honest, growing up as a child, found nature writing very boring because it was an ode of beauty. It would have these long, rich paragraphs, you know, describing things. And there, I'll admit, there's a bit of that in my book. But I found it uninteresting because of the lack of humans. And I think actually almost all nature writing, at least in the UK now, is very human or has human stories, and it brings us together. And I think acknowledging nature as something that isn't separate from us is far more interesting. And like I said earlier, I think if you have a very deep love of nature, you kind of can't be, or maybe shouldn't be, apolitical. I think you have a duty to do your best for it, to speak up. And so I think it's very important that if you're writing about how beautiful and special nature is, you have to acknowledge that it's disappearing.
J'aurais une toute dernière question rapidement.
One quick final question. This session is called The Animal Factor, and this reminds me of what the philosopher Virginie Maris calls the wild part of the world that resists and continues in the face of human control and normalization. Where do you think this wild part of the world is now, if it still exists?
C'est difficile toujours la limite entre le.
It's always difficult to set a boundary between what's wild and what's no longer wild.
Quand on parle des grands prédateurs.
When you talk about the large predators, for example, people say, well, we need bears in the Pyrenees because we need wild nature. I don't know if going to get bears that are in Slovenia, that have been fed by men since birth and then are transferred to the Pyrenees. I don't know, that's not very wild. And then they're released into a habitat that's nothing like their birth habitat. Stop feeding them, and they seek out men. This is a big problem. The first bears that were reintroduced were going through the garbage bins and the rubbish bins in the towns because they were not afraid of men. One was found 30 kilometers from Toulouse. So he was heading toward the city. So is that really, can we call that wild? Is that a wild bear? Is it, what about all the roads that we're building everywhere? Why, we should ask ourselves, why are wild animals disappearing? Okay, they're disappearing because we're killing them, but they're also disappearing because we're building roads, ski resorts. There's no room left for them. In the Pyrenees, over the last 100 years, has been completely changed to allow for tourism. Where is the part of the wild part of the world in that? Are we talking about the idealized idea of wilderness, which is like a big zoo, an open-air zoo? Is that what we're calling nature now? Maya, any thoughts about that? Is there still a part of the world that's wild?
I think one of the amazing things about nature and the environment is how resilient it is, and the fact that if you give it a chance, it will return. And I think because of that, there are pockets of wilderness everywhere. And for me especially, I love seeing the bits of nature that creep back into the city, no matter how hard we try, you know, kind of the empty places where trees are supposed to go and suddenly grass has sprung up that the birds might eat from and things like that. I find that resilience, but, you know, again, very beautiful. I think it's talking about kind of wilderness in the way you were. I think it's very interesting because on one hand, I agree, it's kind of having a very heavy hand in terms of helping wildlife, I think is maybe detrimental. But I think on the other hand, the state of nature now is so artificial that maybe intervening in the name of wilderness is very important. Like I mentioned earlier, the UK is terrible in terms of wildlife, and we have lots of projects like this. It has been very special to see kind of forests replanted, and in particular, they've brought beavers back to the UK, which have been extinct for maybe 500 years, and it's had this incredible knock-on effect. And so even though the beavers are artificial, it's created wetlands where you get mammals and birds, and it's not just a field. And I think I guess my answer is it's complicated, but that nature always wants to return to wilderness. We just need to allow it.
Voilà, j'ouvre un peu la discussion.
Well, I'd like to open the floor to questions from the audience. You can either put a question to one of our writers or make a comment. There's a hand there in the back row. Yes, a word about the bear in the Pyrenees. What are you doing to protect your herds of domestic animals?
Well, we
have shepherds, of course you have to have a human presence with the herd. That's pretty much a done deal. But if there's really an attack, you have to be able to be armed. Warning shots, we're not allowed to even make a warning shot if a bear comes towards our herd now. And if the bear attacks our herd, well, it's a protected species, we're not allowed to kill them. I'm just wondering why this wasn't all planned out with everyone, all of the stakeholders, before they decided to reintroduce the bear. Or maybe the reintroduction should have been done differently with areas where there was no livestock. It's such a divisive issue because it got off to such a bad start, and the two camps don't even want to speak to each other. We have the same situation here in Switzerland with the wolf. Any other questions?
Pour vous aussi, Violaine, si c'est pas trop indiscret, curieuse de savoir pourquoi vous avez arrêté du coup d'élever les bêtes.
Parce que je suis tombée très malade. J'ai attrapé une maladie par une bête.
I fell ill.
Maladie de Lyme, qu'on attrape avec
Lyme
les tiques.
disease
Il y a beaucoup de tiques chez moi.
The ticks that were on my goats.
En permanence par des tiques. J'étais toujours dehors avec mes bêtes.
Tick bites. I was always outdoors with my goats. In France, this is not a disease that that the doctors are good at detecting, so the disease developed. The tests don't always work, so my tests were all negative, and I was almost in a wheelchair. I had the beginnings of Alzheimer, and I said, listen, I have to stop working with these goats because my colleagues would say, if the herder is ill, the herd will fall ill. And I didn't want my goats to be ill, so I decided to stop before they became ill. Yes, the lady in the front row.
Oui, moi j'aurais une remarque. On
I
parle d'écrire au sujet de la nature et tout ça. Mais moi j'ai envie de vous dire, mais continuez à écrire des romans et pas du politique. Parce que finalement, le roman fait autant plus réfléchir, déplace le lecteur autant qu'un discours politique.
If not more than a political essay. There's no pros and cons in a novel. Yes, I think everyone should write in the style and tone that suits them. It so happens that my form is the novel. That's where I'm most comfortable. The novel has a big advantage over a political essay. Often, a political essay is going to be read by people who are already interested in the subject, if not already convinced. People who read my novels do not necessarily share my ideas. Therefore, my audience is not necessarily aligned with me politically. And the strength of the novel is that you can shake people's convictions. They thought they were sure, and this is what I try to do in my books. And I try not to be judgmental. I try to leave things extremely open.
I also, as well as this book, I have 2 children's books that are, you know, much simpler. They're just kind of nice stories about birds and nature and wildlife and people. And one of my favorite things is to go into schools with, you know, very, like maybe 6, 7-year-olds and just talk to them about nature. And these are kids who, you know, aren't going to class themselves as bird watchers or nature lovers, but they'll just be like, does anyone have a fun fact about birds? And they'll be like, me. And it's kind of, I think for me, that's the most obvious example I can think of is how books and kind of, again, literature can inspire enthusiasm and excitement in a way that kind of a very dry lesson wouldn't. But I don't know, I think kids are the future. I love being able to go and talk to them about all this kind of stuff.
Alors, là-bas, il y a 3 mains qui se sont levées. Peut-être
3 hands up, perhaps. And then you, sir, and we'll round off with the person who's up at the back. Well, talking about fun facts, I'd be curious to hear whether you have an amusing story or fun fact about a bird that you encountered.
I think for me, I'm a very big fan of big, scary birds, which you don't really get in Europe. And so, like, I think a fact that everyone knows is that birds are dinosaurs. But I love seeing birds that really are dinosaurs. And one of my favorite birds in the world is called a southern cassowary, which is about 6 foot tall. It lives in Australia. It looks very weird. It cannot fly, and it has these massive talons. And it's one of those birds that has a very scary look in its eye. And I just have a very vivid memory of people that, I'll be polite, kind of American tourists, if we know what I mean, who were getting kind of too close. And we were in the jungle, and it was an adult with 2 chicks, and they were getting closer and closer, and we were like about to intervene because we were like, it's literally going to kill them. And this bird kind of just turned, and it looked them dead in the eye, and it just made them stop. And you could see that in that moment they were suddenly hit with respect for nature that they maybe didn't have before, and it kind of scared them into submission, and it just made me laugh. And it's just moments like that where, you know, nature's kind of scary that I always find very fun.
Oui, alors j'aimerais commencer par une petite anecdote.
Let me start with a short anecdote about the bear. And then I have a question for Maya. I was on the banks of the Gironde River one day, and I saw 4 or 5, 6 trucks from Poland who rolled up and started dumping ducks into the river, live ducks. And the person who seemed to be in charge of this operation was nearby, and I said, what's going on? It was, you know, like when the farmers dump all their tomatoes in front of the town hall because they're upset about tomato prices. Anyway, the person said, well, there's been so much duck hunting here that we have to now import ducks so that people can continue hunting in this area. So we import them every year, and we also import roe deer for the same reason. I said, that's not great, really, as a Methodist. And he said, no, it's not great. The problem is that when we hunt them, the ducks who've been fed by humans come straight up to the hunters. They're semi-tame. So that was a big problem. So that's my story about the ducks and the bear. Maya, perhaps a more general question. I'm very fortunate. I live in the forest. I can watch birds all day long. According to what we all know, 800,000 birds have, a million birds have disappeared in Europe. Every year we have 20 million fewer birds. I'd like to know what the disappearance of these birds means to you philosophically, above and beyond the fact that it's an ecological crisis in China today. We know that birds and bees are disappearing at an alarming rate. They're doing pollination with tweezers. So what do these, the disappearance of all these birds, what does it mean to you?
Well, obviously you're right, it is an ecological crisis, but I also find it incredibly sad because we used to have such deep connection with nature. And I think these days we think of farming and nature as kind of opposites. But there was once a time where they were kind of together. And I say that because in particular it's decline of farmland bird species that's very extreme in Europe. And I think for me it's just the idea that our children's children might not wake up to bird song, might never hear it, might never see them flying, because that's the direction that we're going when human lives have always been so tied up with birds. So much of our folklore and mythology and symbolism is birds, because they've always captured our imagination. And I think that we would lose a part of ourselves actually if we did completely lose our birds. I think it would just be tragic.
Et on n'espère pas ne vivre ces printemps silencieux, comme disait.
Yes, that reminds me of the Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, 1972. Maybe one final question? Thank you. It's not so much a question as a comment in reaction to the idea of novels as opposed to political action. Of course, the two can go hand in hand. I just wanted to explain what can happen here in Switzerland. I'm a member of an NGO fighting to protect the wolf, but also herds at high altitude. The fewer animals we will lose, the less they'll be able to justify killing the wolf. But coming back to the idea of novels or political writings, I think that your work is on the bright side of the force. The situation, the political situation in the field is desperate in Europe. In my opinion, it's totally necessary to take political action. The wolf is a very intelligent animal but can't vote. So if we don't do it for the wolf, who will? Thank you. Would you like to make a comment? I didn't say novel or political action or essays. These are two completely different things. I wasn't advocating one or the other. Alain Damasio, the novelist, says that the novel is the greatest form of militant action. Yes, well, everybody has their own form. What's important is working in the area where you're the most effective and using the form that's most effective for you.
I think for my book, I didn't intend on it being political originally, and it was more that the more I talked about nature, the more my politics slipped in, maybe, or it felt like I couldn't talk about one without the other. But I think storytelling is so important. I mentioned earlier that we have the science, but it's about communication. And I think wolves are a lovely example of that, because I think one of the issues is that in European folklore, wolves are always the enemy, and that makes sense. But there are so many stories that have taught us for generations to be afraid of wolves, that we don't want them in our lives, we don't want them near our livestock. For me, at least, all the villains of my bedtime stories were wolves. And I think when you're taught that lesson over and over again, you obviously wouldn't want a creature like that in your life. You think of them as dangerous, even though they're not really. And I think that in the UK especially, where there's not very much space, so people would be coming into contact with these animals, there's such a strong resistance. And I think overall, when you're not used to having true wilderness, true wildlife, it scares people because you're not used to it. We're so used to being in control of our environment, and I think that that's the thing that we need to let go of. And I think maybe storytelling and learning how to allow the wilderness to be wild is a really important part of that.
And to conclude and to react to what the gentleman has just said, what we wanted to do this evening was to prove that otherness needs to be shown and made visible and given a place at the table. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much, Maya. Thank you, Violaine. I'd like to invite you all to continue this conversation upstairs over a glass of something. And if you would like to have the book signed for you, on the 28th of November, we will have the last session of the series, The Spirit of the Mountain, with Matteo Righetto. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you to our two authors.